The neurotypical doctors are really not okay. Today's bad science comes to you from Dr. Michael Greger, a nutritionist, animal rights campaigner, food safety advocate, and until recently, I thought he was pretty reasonable. And author of the book How Not to Die, that I've got sitting around somewhere at home. He's got over 1 million subscribers on his YouTube channel, and he's made a video series about diet and autism. Now I know what you're thinking. Someone who advocates for a diet comprised mostly of whole, plant-based, fruit and vegetables, nuts and legumes, it isn't exactly controversial. We all need to eat more plants, fruits and vegetables. I'm a vegan myself, and I've followed a lot of Dr. Greger's content in the past, and it's generally about the benefits of eating more whole foods. But his takes on autism are wild.
Autism currently affects about 1 of 68 kids in the United States, yet we don't even have drugs to treat the core symptoms. Forget the underlying disease itself.
But autism isn't a disease, and it isn't a symptom of an underlying disease. Autism is a complex neurodevelopmental condition. The diagnostic frameworks, the DSM-5 in the US and ICD-11 elsewhere, classify autism as a spectrum of traits, not a pathology. The NHS website says being autistic doesn't mean that you have an illness or disease. It means that your brain works in a different way from other people. Autism isn't something that can be treated in the way he talks about, like a cold or a flu.
The disease appears to be on the rise. Twins that share the same DNA may not share the disease more than half the time. The events that pull the trigger may actually give rise to the disease. For autism medical literature, even though nearly everybody knowledgeable about the disease, both parent and professional alike who deals with it day to day, evidently knows about it.
Calling it a disease makes it sound like something really horrible that needs to be fixed, and that is not the reality of autism.
I mean, we can treat some symptoms, just not the core symptoms of the disorder. Sure, if you're aggressive, we can give you antipsychotic drugs, stimulants like Ritalin for ADHD, or we can knock you out to help you sleep. But for social and communication improvements, the main signs and symptoms of autism, we have little to offer, and the disease appears to be on the rise. What can we do about it?
Maybe stop calling it a disease for a start. The paper that Greger cites is called New Assessments and Treatments in ASD, which is a pretty pathological paper written by 2 researchers. The primary author is the creator of the generalised screening test, the RITA-T, for identification of autistic toddlers, which you might think is a good thing, bearing in mind that neurotypical developmental trajectory is different to autistic developmental trajectory, or as they refer to it in this paper, history of regression, which is nice to know. Because I was a late speaker, I am regressive, and yet look at me now. The paper takes a dispassionate view on the treatments, which it says, current conventional treatment of ASD in children includes intensive behavioural interventions, known as applied behavioural analysis, or ABA. And they continue to expand on treatments for gastrointestinal issues, which occurs with autism at higher rates than the general population, but it isn't autism, and they discuss treatments options for sleep issues, such as melatonin, and that's not autism either.
Well, decades ago, a clue was published that offered a ray of hope. When autistic kids get a fever, they invariably display dramatically more normal behavior, including a greater desire or ability to communicate. They could become less withdrawn, more alert, more talkative, more communicative.
So says Michael Greger. His clue? It's a letter to the editor of the Journal of Nature, published in 1985. Also published alongside astrology and cosmobiology and parapsychology. Are these clues too, Dr. Greger? So let's summarise so far. Greger claims incorrectly that autism is a disease, and that past anecdotal comments, mostly from parents of autistic children, is that their autistic children with fevers become more sociable. Greger shows research into how heat shock proteins protect and repair synapses in the brain. Therefore, broccoli could somehow mimic these effects and potentially treat autism through its sulforaphane content. This idea that autistic children become more normal when they don't have a fever is an old one, and it doesn't come from autistic people themselves, but from reports from their parents. And I mean, sure, maybe some parents of autistic kids have observed exactly that. But do we really want to base a theory, a hypothesis, on some parents' anecdotal observations from the 80s? And then he talks about broccoli's sulforaphane content as if it could somehow treat autism, based on research that barely connects to what he's saying. Sorry, this is a leap, not a bridge.
And there's this compound sulforaphane that upregulates those heat shock proteins, so you could potentially get the benefits without the fever. Sulforaphane is made by broccoli, kale, cabbage, collards, and cauliflower. In other words, cruciferous vegetables. So maybe if we give some broccoli to those with autism, it will make things better by boosting the heat shock proteins.
What also floats in water?
Braid, a duck.
Exactly.
In 2021, a study looking at the effectiveness of sulforaphane to reduce autistic traits was conducted. It was a randomized controlled trial in autistic children, and it found no significant improvements in primary outcomes, that is, fewer expressions of autistic characteristics, as defined by the Aberrant Behaviour Checklist, which ranks such things as self-injurious behaviours alongside wanting to be alone or having flat affect. One of the criteria is odd, bizarre in behaviour. And this Aberrant Behaviour Checklist itself is from 1985, and it's been used in hundreds of studies. Hundreds. And it was developed on adults in residential care facilities, and it relies on the parent and caregiver's reports of the autistic person. And this behaviour checklist only has what's called a scientific marginal fit when tested on autistic children in real-world cases. The tool doesn't perfectly match autistic behaviours and pathologises some, using phrases like uncooperative and disobedient, which, from an outside observer, might be true, but there could be some very good reasons for this disobedience. At the risk of waffling, what I want you to take away from this is that autism is measured using sometimes very pathological tools which don't quite fit real-world autistic people very well. And when you hear talk about autism symptoms, treatments and cures, it usually boils down to a parent or caregiver checking a slightly different box for how disobedient the autistic person in their care is that day, in their opinion. When we have single blind studies into diet and autism, the researchers won't know which child ate what diet. But the parents do. And it's the parents that score how the autistic traits have changed as a result of this new diet. Do you see a very obvious problem here?
So in these autism studies, here the parents are upending their family's diet, hoping, expecting that their child will get better, and maybe unconsciously treating them differently such that they end up behaving differently when assessed later by the blinded investigators. There were some promising case reports, though. For example, this 2-year-old with autism deficient in D, whose autism seemed to improve after vitamin D supplementation. But you don't know if it's a fluke until you put it to the test. A study on the efficacy of vitamin D supplementation in 83 autistic children, and 80% got better in terms of their behavior, eye contact, attention span, concluding vitamin D is inexpensive, readily available, safe, and may have beneficial effects.
As for vitamin D supplementation, also claimed by Dr. Greger to improve core manifestations of autism, the first double-blind controlled trial from 2016, which linked some benefits in reduction of irritability and social withdrawal, said itself that larger studies are needed. Autistic children might well have lower vitamin D levels, but it could be due to lower sun exposure. It's a correlation, not causation issue.
At this point, you'd expect me to make some crack about big broccoli and how such a study would never get funded, and you'd be right. Until now. See, there are family foundations out there, non-profit foundations, that just want to see people with autism get better, whether or not corporate stock prices get better too.
Okay, so who are these generous family foundations funding this autism research then, and what do they want? Well, the study references the N of 1 Foundation, which, let's be real, sounds like something out of a bad science fiction movie. Their website says, "We have a different approach to autism research that is getting results. We believe that once we understand the biological basis of autism and how it develops," autism doesn't develop any more than your eye colour does. "We can make much more rapid progress on treatments and prevention." Treatments and prevention of autism. Yeah, because that's how science works, right? Just a sample size of 1. I've got navy-coloured socks on today, and my male Came an hour early, so it must be the socks. Can't possibly be anything else. Also, their website is nophone.org, which is funny because many autistic people don't like phone calls, myself included. So, what's the harm? Nursing Times, under their learning disabilities category, reported on this as broccoli could hold the key for treating autism. Autism Parenting magazine, don't laugh, they're actually one of the largest sponsors of the Autism Parenting Summit. That's a conference that Dr. Michael Greger spoke at just this October, also repeated these claims just a few weeks ago. On the same week, they also published the article, Camel Milk for Autism, What are the Benefits? I'm not even joking.
Ever have a camel milk chai latte?
Ugh. Brother, ugh. What's that?
Camel milk.
On one hand, they're promoting whole food, plant-based diets for autism, and on the other hand, they're promoting suckling off a camel.
Brother, ugh.
All for the prevention and improvement of autism symptoms. Look, it's sarcasm, but I actually wish I was joking. Now, don't get me wrong, broccoli is awesome. It's healthy, it's nutritious, and it's a great addition to any diet. But let's not get carried away and pretend that it's some kind of magical cure for autism. It's irresponsible to make such sweeping claims about diet treatments when the science doesn't back it up. Autistic people face a variety of challenges, and promoting these kinds of fixes could do more harm than good. Because autistic people are known to sometimes have restricted food intake, and there is a higher prevalence of sensory sensitivities that can affect their relationship with food. If we think that by restricting someone's diet, after all, they're talking about children here, it might be better that they eat something that they find familiar and safe, without restrictions, than go for something maybe more nutritious and struggle to eat it. And let's spare a thought for those autistic people who live within residential care facilities. I spoke about this group in my video on profound autism recently. They're being looked after and cared for by a staff team who will be eating in general a Western diet. Speaking as a vegan for a moment, and one that can choose what to eat, and there being a wide variety of foods, this sadly isn't what the majority of society understands plant-based food to be. Which means you've got non-vegans shopping and meal planning for an autistic vegan service user who has a plant-based meal forced on them. It's not going to be very high quality. Sometimes going out for a meal to a restaurant as a vegan means you get the one option, which is usually pretty mid, I'm sorry to say. Making sweeping dietary recommendations without considering these individual differences and challenges could potentially cause more harm than good, especially when those recommendations are based on weak scientific evidence, and in general, nobody understands the science anyway. In another video, Dr. Greger posts, titled Double-Blind Clinical Trial of Diet for Autism, he doesn't actually talk about a double-blind study in that whole video, only teasing it towards the end of his video and saying watch the next one. Maybe I should try that.
Problem is there hadn't been any double-blind studies that lasted that long until now. We'll find out what they found next. Researchers at the University of Florida broke through the impasse by performing a double-blind study. Now, this is not an easy thing to do. I mean, you have to provide all meals and snacks so that the families remain clueless as to whether they were randomized into the gluten and casein-free diet group or were actually in the control group getting the same foods but with gluten and casein slipped in. Then, after 6 weeks, they switched the food, so the gluten-free, casein-free group started getting wheat and dairy, and the wheat and dairy control group were covertly switched to gluten and casein-free. No statistically significant findings, though several parents did report an improvement in their children, claiming marked improvements in language, decreased hyperactivity, decreased tantrums, so much so that a bunch of the parents decided to keep the children on the diet even though the researchers just told them that it didn't work.
That double-blind clinical trial of diet for autism actually concludes with a warning. Although these findings must be interpreted with caution because of the small sample size, this study does not provide evidence to support general use of the gluten-free, casein-free diet. He does, however, show the comments that our double-blind, placebo-controlled study of 14 children on the gluten-free, casein-free diet did not detect an impact of dietary changes on measures of physiologic function, behavioural disturbance, sleep deprivation or overactivity, or ASD-related behaviours.
The non-double-blind studies that showed an effect had kids on the diet for a year or two. And so the failure to find an effect in the double-blind study should not necessarily be interpreted to mean that diet doesn't work, given the relatively shorter duration of dietary intervention.
He also highlights a systemic review of dietary interventions whose results showed studies evaluating gluten-free, casein-free diets reported some parent-rated improvements in communication and challenging behaviours. However, data was inadequate to make conclusions about the body of evidence. And evidence for the effectiveness of gluten-free, casein-free diets in children with ASD is weak, and thus these diets cannot be generally recommended as a treatment. Now, there is some evidence that it might help people with celiac disease, but that's a whole different issue than autism. The study he mentions finds no significant impact from diet on autism core features, yet Greger's response? Well, they just didn't stick with the diet long enough.
OK, but this study only lasted 4 weeks. And diet proponents suggest it may take months off gluten and casein to properly assess a response.
So obviously we should have just given it more time. Except autism isn't celiac disease. You can't just force a dietary intervention and expect it to cure something that's not even a disease. You might find that changing your diet helps. I certainly have. It's not gluten-free because I quite like gluten. Pizza would never be the same without it. And oat milk is a fantastic substitute for dairy. But I'm an adult, and I'm not imposing on others. The National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, or NICE, provide guidance and advice to improve health and social care in the UK. Their advice for specific interventions for the core features of autism, note features, not symptoms, do not use the following interventions for the management of core features of autism in children and young people. Exclusion diets, such as gluten or casein-free diets. Some people have food allergies. Autistic children are just as likely to have food allergies or intolerances as the general population, but they do have higher levels of anxiety. In fact, it's possible that all of this talk about broccoli and gluten as far as autism is concerned, we're entirely missing the point. Completely. In the study, Lack of Associations Between Dietary Intake and GI Symptoms in Autism, the authors suggest that dietary variations do not appear to drive GI symptoms in autistic people, and that furthermore, there may be other factors associated with lower GI tract symptoms in autism, such as increased stress response. Some autistic people have pica, which is a compulsive craving and eating of things that aren't food. Cardboard, mud, sticks, grass, screws, you name it. It's potentially very dangerous. Some autistic people will eat differently too, not necessarily following the same eating etiquette and patterns that neurotypicals do. I used to eat broccoli as a child, but I'd swallow the whole thing. Like branches, leaves and all. It looked like a tree, after all. And it kind of feels like a tree when you're eating it. All the leafy bits just sort of brushing inside your mouth like it doesn't want to be eaten. Do you know what I mean? I've been here before with Harvard-trained psychiatrists. If you have a YouTube channel and a large audience and you're promoting yourself as highly qualified and educated, the burden of ensuring that your content is accurate, not needlessly dramatic and balanced, is, well, it's the burden of competence. Don't spoil it by calling autism a disease in your first sentence. Talking of diseases, Dr. Greger takes an epidemic view, just like very many other healthcare entrepreneur sort of grifter types. I feel bad saying that. On his website, Dr. Greger says, before speculating about the reason for the explosive increase in autism, one has to make sure the explosion is real.
Autism is currently considered a multifactorial disorder resulting from both genetic and non-genetic risk factors. Yes, it can run in families, but genetic factors may account for only 10 to 20% of autism cases.
And yet, a study published a year later, which reanalyzes and updates the genetic heritability factors, gives a score for about 90% genetic heritability of autism, not 10 to 20%, especially as one article states the prevalence of autism has exploded.
Since autism as a medical condition was first described, the prevalence of autism has apparently exploded from like 1 in 5,000 individuals to 1 in 68 now, more than 1% of the population. That would be like a 7,000% increase. And indeed, you'll see graphs like this, showing an exponential increase in the prevalence of autism from no diagnosed cases in the early 1900s, to the prevalence shooting through the roof in the 80s and 90s. And so that immediately gets you thinking, what happened around that time that could account for the explosion?
It's not the prevalence of autism, it's the increase of new autism diagnoses. These are entirely different things and should never be conflated. Now, Gregor does partly address this.
Of course, there were no diagnosed cases in the early 1900s. It didn't even have a name until 1943. The bottom line is that while we may never really know what the prevalence was a half-century ago, we do have decent data over the last few decades that really does point to a considerable increase in the true prevalence.
Which is all very reasonable, but Gregor then cites an article from 2010 which claims a link between autism and heavy metal toxins.
So yeah, we may quibble whether the increase was 800% or closer to 2,000%, but the bottom line seems to be autism rates are really increasing. And so the question legitimately then turns to why?
I've covered the autism diagnosis rates increase in my video linked in the description below, and while you're there checking it out, if you enjoy my science-related content, please feel free to click the subscribe button, and if you haven't already, give the video a like and a comment. His next video leads onto heavy metal urine testing and collation for autism, in which he says,
environmental risk factors, meaning non-genetic risk factors, may play a significant role in autism, given the fact that even identical twins that share the same DNA may not share the disease more than half the time.
He's entirely wrong, since genetic factors are predominant and account for around 90% of autism cases, as shown by more recent twin studies. And autism is not a disease. Again, it never has been, and honestly never will be. The hypothesis is that mercury and lead toxicity can cause symptoms that are superficially similar to some autistic characteristics, and only when looking in from the outside, that is, like in a clinic setting. For example, lead exposure via lead paint, contaminated food and water, causes IQ deficits in the brain, which is similar to ASD's symptoms. But is it, though? Because the belief that autistic people have a lower IQ than the general population, as though we're somehow similar to a neurotypical brain, but broken with lead exposure, is a myth. And I have a video about this also in the description below. Happy watching later on. Good bedtime content. Lead poisoning can also cause slurred speech, which they correlate as being similar to a symptom of autism, whilst mercury can cause social withdrawal. And this is the very highly related to category. And a lack of concentration too. They've obviously not included autistic hyperfixations in their research cohort, because compared to an autistic's hyperfixation, neurotypicals are the ones having trouble focusing, and they're the ones with trouble with memory loss. They're the lead brain folks. And social withdrawal is not a symptom of autism or heavy metal poisoning. It's a consequence of living in a toxic society. Who wouldn't want to withdraw from environments that aren't suitable for us? And socially, neurodivergent brains get along with each other just as well as neurotypical brains do with each other. This is the double empathy problem coined by Dr. Damien Milton in 2012 to explain that paradox. It's not one of deficit unless the deficits go both ways. There are organisations that would push a narrative of toxins as being the cause of autism and detoxing as being the solution. Conveniently, their product offering to take your money in exchange for removing the horrible autism toxins. There's a video on my Patreon about Epidemic Answers and Documenting Hope, both related organisations that make a great deal of income from gullible parents, but they've even published a bogus study in which they claim autism reversal by essentially a lot of ABAing and a lot of detoxing. Get the 5G out. I'm not joking. Some of this detoxing is actually quite dangerous, and I'm glad Dr. Gregor attends to this, and some autistic children have sadly died as a result of these therapies. Clearly, his bias, and to some extent my own, is that fish and seafood do contain accumulated mercury, and if you can avoid it, why not? But it's got nothing to do with autism, and eating seafood won't give you autism no matter how hard you try. Which is a shame, because videos like this take up a lot of my time and energy, and I need to top up my autism reserves. Please send me some autism in the comments section below if you can spare it. And I get it. Dr. Greger is passionate about plant-based diets and the benefits of healthy eating, and I agree with him on a lot of things. But when it comes to autism, why is it always when it comes to autism? What's wrong with these people? Spreading misinformation like this does real harm. And it is misinformation. Autism isn't a disease that needs fixing, it's part of who we are. Because being neurotypical isn't the only way to be. Autism is a natural variation of human brains. And if, Dr. Greger, you're watching this, feel free to reach out to me. I've bought your books, I've cooked your recipes. Is it enough to promote healthy eating without wishful thinking? And if you want to help, we need to focus on acceptance, appreciation even, and support, not cures. And I'll give you the intro to your next video. Autism is not a disease, but some people believe it is. The video to watch next is the playlist of my other science communication and debunking videos. Click here to see it next, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.